Edward Kensington lived a life most people could only dream of. He was rich, powerful, and admired by everyone who crossed his path. His mansion sat on acres of lush green land, with fountains in the driveway and chandeliers that sparkled like stars inside. Edward's company dominated the tech industry, earning him millions every year. Yet despite all this wealth, there was one thing that completed his picture-perfect life: his wife, Margaret. Margaret wasn't just any woman. She was the heart of their home. She had been with Edward since their college days when they were young, broke, and full of dreams. Back then, they shared everything: laughter, struggles, and even peanut butter sandwiches when money was tight. Margaret supported Edward through thick and thin, cheering him on as he climbed the ladder of success. In return, Edward promised her forever. Together, they became the golden couple everyone envied. They attended charity events, posed for magazine covers, and vacationed in places others only saw in travel brochures. But as time went on, something shifted within Edward. The thrill of building an empire had faded, replaced by long hours at work and endless meetings. Margaret tried to keep things exciting, planning date nights and weekend getaways, but Edward seemed distant. He told himself it was stress from work, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. His once fiery passion for life, and for Margaret, had dimmed. One day, while attending a glamorous party, Edward met Isabella. She was younger, vibrant, and oozed confidence. Her laughter filled the room, and her charm caught Edward's attention instantly. At first, he dismissed his fascination with her as harmless admiration. But soon, harmless turned into frequent encounters, late-night conversations, and secret meetings. Isabella made him feel alive again, reminding him of the excitement he thought he'd lost. Meanwhile, Margaret noticed changes in Edward too. He came home later, seemed distracted during meals, and avoided talking about the future. One evening, unable to ignore her suspicions anymore, Margaret confronted him. "Is there someone else?" she asked, her voice trembling. Edward hesitated, guilt flashing across his face. When he finally admitted the truth, Margaret felt like the ground beneath her feet had crumbled. She gave him a choice: stay and fix their marriage or leave for good. For days, Edward wrestled with his decision. On one hand, Margaret represented stability and love. On the other, Isabella symbolized adventure and freedom. In the end, his desire for something new won over. He chose Isabella, leaving Margaret heartbroken. Their divorce made headlines, painting Edward as the villain and Margaret as the victim. Friends took sides, and even their daughter, Emily, struggled to understand why her father walked away. As Edward started his new chapter with Isabella, he convinced himself it was the right decision. Life without Margaret felt lighter, freer. But little did he know, this choice would set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. For now, though, Edward basked in the glow of his fresh start, unaware of the storm brewing on the horizon. The day Edward left Margaret, the world around them seemed to pause. It wasn't just their family that shattered. It was the image of perfection they had built together over decades. Margaret didn't cry or scream when Edward packed his bags. Instead, she stood silently in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly as if trying to hold herself together. Her eyes, usually warm and inviting, now carried a sadness so deep it felt like an unspoken accusation. "You'll regret this," she said softly before turning away, leaving Edward alone with his guilt. For weeks after the split, whispers spread like wildfire. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers dissected every detail of their failed marriage. Tabloids plastered their faces across headlines. Tech tycoon dumps wife for younger woman. Photos of Isabella appeared everywhere. Her dazzling smile, her designer outfits, her seemingly carefree life. Meanwhile, Margaret disappeared from public view altogether. She focused all her energy on raising their teenage daughter, Emily, shielding her from the chaos surrounding them. But Emily wasn't blind to what was happening. She saw how her mother cried late at night and how empty the house felt without Edward's presence. Edward, however, tried to convince himself he'd made the right choice. Life with Isabella was exciting, at least at first. She brought a whirlwind of energy into his life, dragging him to parties, art galleries, and exotic vacations. For a while, Edward felt like he was living in a movie, surrounded by glitz and glamour. But beneath the surface, cracks began to form. Isabella wasn't content with simply being his partner. She wanted more. More gifts, more attention, more money. Every outing came with a price tag, and every compliment seemed laced with expectation. One evening, during a charity gala, Edward found himself standing awkwardly beside Isabella as she chatted animatedly with a group of socialites. He glanced around the room, noticing familiar faces who once respected him, now looking at him with judgmental eyes. Some whispered behind their hands, others avoided meeting his gaze altogether. Edward shifted uncomfortably, feeling out of place despite being surrounded by luxury. For the first time, he wondered if he traded something real for something hollow. Things only grew worse at home. Isabella's demands became relentless. She insisted on redecorating their penthouse, buying expensive jewelry, and hosting extravagant dinners that drained Edward's patience. Arguments erupted frequently, often over trivial matters like dinner reservations or forgotten anniversaries. Edward started missing the quiet evenings he used to share with Margaret, where conversation flowed naturally and laughter came easily. With Isabella, everything felt forced, calculated, and exhausting. Meanwhile, Margaret worked hard to rebuild her life. She sold their old house, moving into a modest apartment closer to Emily's school. She took up gardening, filling her small balcony with pots of flowers and herbs. Slowly but surely, she rediscovered pieces of herself she'd lost during years of catering to Edward's ambitions. Though her heart still ached, she refused to let bitterness consume her. Instead, she poured her love into Emily, determined to give her daughter the stability Edward had abandoned. As months turned into years, Edward realized the cost of his choices weighed heavier than he'd anticipated. His relationship with Isabella grew colder, marked by arguments and growing resentment. At work, his focus wavered, distracted by thoughts of what he'd given up. Late at night, when the noise of his new life faded, he found himself staring at old photos of Margaret and Emily, wondering if he could ever undo the damage he'd caused. The betrayal he'd inflicted lingered not just in Margaret's heart, but also in his own, haunting him in ways he couldn't escape. And yet Edward told himself it was too late to turn back. He had chosen this path, and now he had to live with its consequences. Or so he thought. Little did he know, fate had other plans in store. Plans that would force him to confront the past in ways he never imagined. Life with Isabella was like living in a never-ending whirlwind. Everything about her screamed excitement. Her laugh echoed louder than anyone else's in the room. Her wardrobe sparkled under every light, and her energy seemed boundless. For Edward, it felt intoxicating at first. After years of what he called the predictable monotony of his marriage to Margaret, Isabella offered him a chance to step into a world full of glamour and spontaneity. But as time went on, that initial thrill began to wear thin. Isabella thrived on attention, and she expected Edward to provide it constantly. If they attended an event, she wanted him by her side, introducing her to influential people and ensuring everyone noticed how radiant she looked. At home, she demanded perfection. The penthouse they shared was redecorated 3 times in 2 years because she claimed it didn't reflect their status. Each piece of furniture, each painting on the wall, had to be expensive and eye-catching. Edward found himself signing checks for things he barely cared about, all while wondering if this was really what happiness looked like. Their arguments became more frequent, often sparked by the smallest issues. One evening, Edward forgot to book reservations at Isabella's favorite restaurant for their anniversary. What should have been a simple oversight turned into a heated fight. "You don't care about me," Isabella shouted, pacing back and forth in their living room. Edward tried to calm her down, but his words only made things worse. By the end of the night, they were both exhausted, sitting in silence on opposite ends of the couch. It wasn't just the fights that drained Edward, it was the emptiness that followed them. At work, Edward struggled to focus. His mind kept drifting back to memories of Margaret. He remembered how she used to greet him after long days at the office with a warm smile and a cup of tea. She didn't need grand gestures or lavish gifts to feel loved. Her presence alone was enough to make him feel grounded. Now, surrounded by luxury, Edward couldn't shake the feeling that something vital was missing from his life. He missed the quiet moments, the genuine connection he once took for granted. To distract himself, Edward threw himself into his business. He expanded his company, launched new projects, and traveled extensively. Work became his refuge, a place where he could temporarily forget the growing dissatisfaction in his personal life. Yet, no matter how busy he stayed, guilt lingered in the corners of his mind. Images of Margaret and Emily would flash before him during meetings or late at night when sleep evaded him. He wondered how Emily was doing, whether she still thought of him as her father, or if she even wanted him in her life anymore. Edward also couldn't ignore the whispers around him. Friends and acquaintances who once admired him now viewed him differently. Some pitied him, others judged him harshly for leaving Margaret. Even Isabella's friends treated him with a mix of curiosity and disdain, as though he were nothing more than a trophy husband funding her lifestyle. Edward hated the way people looked at him, but he couldn't blame them. Deep down, he knew he'd brought this judgment upon himself. Still, Edward convinced himself that going back wasn't an option. He had made his choice, and there was no undoing it. Or so he believed. Life moved forward, carrying him along its unpredictable currents. Little did he know, fate had plans to remind him of the past in ways he least expected. Somewhere out there, pieces of his history waited patiently to resurface, ready to challenge everything he thought he knew about himself and force him to face the consequences of his actions. Years had passed since Edward left Margaret, and though his life with Isabella was far from perfect, he had grown accustomed to its rhythm. Work kept him busy, and the constant distractions helped him avoid confronting the emptiness that lingered in his heart. But one day, during a high-profile business conference in another city, something happened that would shake the foundation of his carefully constructed world. The event was held in a grand hotel ballroom, filled with influential people from all over the country. Edward mingled effortlessly, exchanging handshakes and polite smiles as he navigated the crowd. He was used to these gatherings, faces blurred together. Conversations felt repetitive. But then, something unusual caught his eye. Across the room, sitting at a small table near the buffet, were 4 children. They weren't just any children. They were quadruplets, each one identical yet unique in their own way. What struck Edward most was how much they resembled him. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light or his imagination playing games. But the more he looked, the clearer it became. The sharp jawline, the piercing blue eyes, even the slight dimple on their cheeks. It was uncanny. His stomach tightened as curiosity mixed with disbelief. Who were these kids, and why did they look so much like him? Unable to ignore the nagging feeling inside, Edward approached them cautiously. "Hi there," he said, forcing a friendly smile. The children turned to look at him, their expressions curious but unguarded. One of them, a boy with tousled brown hair, spoke up first. "Are you here for the conference too?" he asked innocently. Edward nodded, still trying to process what he was seeing. "Yes, I am. My name's Edward. What about you guys?" The boy grinned. "I'm Noah." He pointed to his siblings in turn. "This is Ava, Liam, and Sophie." Edward shook hands with each of them, marveling at how natural it felt. There was an ease in their demeanor, a warmth that reminded him of someone. But he couldn't quite place who. "You all look very familiar," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "Do your parents work in tech or business?" The children exchanged glances before Ava answered. "Our mom lives nearby. She works a lot, so we come to events like this sometimes. We don't see our dad, though. Mom says he doesn't know about us." Edward froze. The room seemed to spin around him as those words sank in. Doesn't know about us. His mind raced with questions. Could it be possible? Was it mere coincidence that these children bore such a striking resemblance to him? Or was there something deeper, something he had unknowingly set into motion years ago? Before he could ask anything else, a woman approached the table. She introduced herself as Claire, the children's mother. Edward recognized her immediately. Claire had been a colleague years ago, someone he briefly dated during a weak moment in his marriage to Margaret. Their relationship hadn't lasted long, and they'd parted ways without much thought. Now, standing face to face with her again, Edward realized the truth was staring him right in the eyes. Claire noticed his shock and quickly ushered the children away, promising to explain later. As they walked off, Edward stood rooted to the spot, his mind reeling. How could this have happened? Why hadn't she told him? And what did it mean for his already complicated life? For the first time in years, Edward felt truly vulnerable, unsure of how to move forward. Little did he know, this encounter would change everything, for better or worse. After the initial shock of meeting the Quadruplets wore off, Edward found himself unable to focus on anything else. The conference sessions blurred into the background as his mind replayed every detail of his encounter with Noah, Ava, Liam, and Sophie. Their faces haunted him, those familiar features that mirrored his own. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a bizarre coincidence. By the time Claire returned to speak with him later that evening, Edward's curiosity had turned into an overwhelming need for answers. Claire appeared calm but guarded as she approached him in the hotel lobby. "We should talk," she said simply, gesturing toward a quiet corner away from the crowd. Edward followed her silently, his heart pounding with anticipation. Once they were seated, Claire took a deep breath before beginning her story. "It happened shortly after we saw each other last," Claire explained, choosing her words carefully. Her voice carried a mix of sadness and resolve. "I didn't plan it, Edward. It just happened. When I realized I was pregnant, I knew I had to make a decision." She paused, glancing at him briefly before continuing. "I decided not to tell you. At the time, I thought it was for the best. You were married, focused on your career, and I didn't want to complicate your life, or mine." Edward listened intently, his emotions swirling like a storm inside him. Anger, guilt, confusion, they all fought for dominance. How could she keep something like this from him? But even as the question swirled in his mind, he couldn't deny the weight of responsibility settling over him. These were his children, his flesh and blood, and he hadn't been there for them. Not for their births, not for their first steps, not for any of the milestones that shaped who they were today. "I raised them on my own," Claire continued, her tone softening slightly. "It wasn't easy, but I had help from my family. They're good kids, Edward. Smart, kind, and full of potential. I never wanted them to feel like they were missing out because of circumstances beyond their control." Edward nodded slowly, absorbing her words. Despite the complexity of the situation, one thing became painfully clear. He had missed out on so much. His chest tightened as he imagined what it must have been like for Claire to carry the burden of raising 4 children alone while he lived his privileged life, oblivious to their existence. And then there were the Quadruplets themselves. The laughter, the struggles, the everyday moments that made up their childhoods. Moments he should have been part of. "Why now?" Edward asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you reach out sooner?" Claire hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I didn't think it would change anything. You moved on with your life, and I did the same. Bringing you into theirs felt risky. It still does. But seeing you here today, maybe it's a sign. Maybe it's time." The weight of her words hit Edward like a tidal wave. This wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was about taking responsibility. For years, he had run from the consequences of his choices, convincing himself that starting fresh with Isabella meant leaving the past behind. But now, faced with the undeniable reality of his children, He realized how hollow that belief truly was. As the night drew to a close, Edward thanked Claire for telling him the truth. Though their conversation left him with more questions than answers, one thing was certain: his life was about to change forever. The quadruplets weren't just a revelation. They were a second chance. A chance to be the father he never knew he needed to be. But as Edward walked back to his hotel room, he couldn't help but wonder. Could he really step up after all these years? Or was it too late to make amends, not just with them, but with everyone he'd hurt along the way? The days following his encounter with the quadruplets and Claire weighed heavily on Edward. He couldn't stop thinking about them, about the lives they had built without him, about the years he had missed, and about the role he was supposed to play now. For the first time in a long while, Edward felt a deep sense of purpose stirring within him. But it wasn't going to be easy. Rebuilding trust, especially after so much time had passed, would require patience, humility, and genuine effort. Edward decided to start by reaching out to Margaret. It wasn't just guilt driving him this time. It was a realization that he needed to confront the wreckage he'd left behind. Picking up the phone felt like stepping into uncharted territory. His hands trembled as he dialed her number, unsure of how she would react. To his surprise, Margaret answered. Her voice was calm but distant, carrying an edge of caution. "Margaret," Edward began, his tone hesitant. "I know I don't deserve your time, but I need to talk to you. About Emily." There was a long pause on the other end. Finally, Margaret spoke. "What do you want, Edward? You made your choice years ago." Her words stung, but Edward knew she was right. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said quietly. I want to see Emily, if she'll let me. I've been absent for too long, and I can't change that. But maybe I can try to make things better, for her sake." Margaret didn't respond immediately. Edward could hear the faint rustle of movement on her end, as if she were weighing her options. After what felt like an eternity, she sighed. "Emily's grown up now, Edward. She's not the same little girl who used to run to you after school. She has feelings, hurt ones, and I won't let you waltz back into her life only to disappoint her again." Edward nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I understand, and I respect that. I'm not here to disrupt anything. I miss her. I miss both of you." Another pause followed, longer this time. Then Margaret spoke again, her voice softer. "I'll talk to her, but don't get your hopes up. She might not want to see you." Though her response wasn't exactly encouraging, Edward felt a flicker of hope. Margaret hadn't outright rejected him, and that was more than he deserved. Over the next few weeks, he waited anxiously, checking his phone constantly for any sign of communication. Finally, Margaret called him back. "She agreed to meet you," she said, her tone neutral. "But under one condition. No promises, no excuses, just honesty." Edward promised to abide by her terms. When he finally met Emily at a quiet cafe near her college campus, he barely recognized her. Gone was the bubbly teenager he remembered. In her place stood a confident young woman with Margaret's warmth and his sharp features. She greeted him politely but kept her distance, her body language guarded. Their conversation started awkwardly, filled with long silences and cautious small talk. But as they talked, Emily opened up slightly, sharing bits and pieces of her life. Her studies, her dreams, her struggles growing up without him. Edward listened intently, his heart breaking with every word. When it was his turn to speak, he chose his words carefully, apologizing sincerely for abandoning her and promising to be present moving forward, if she'd allow it. Emily didn't offer forgiveness right away, but she didn't shut him out completely either. That alone gave Edward hope. Meanwhile, Edward also reached out to Claire and the quadruplets. He offered financial support, which Claire accepted reluctantly, and began spending time with Noah, Ava, Liam, and Sophie whenever possible. At first, their interactions were awkward. He was practically a stranger, but over time, they warmed up to him. They played board games, went on outings, and shared stories about their lives. Each moment together brought Edward closer to understanding the family he never knew he had. As he juggled reconnecting with two separate families, Edward realized something profound. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past, it was about making amends in the present. He couldn't undo the pain he'd caused, but he could work tirelessly to rebuild what he'd broken. And perhaps, in doing so, find a measure of peace he hadn't known he was searching for. Edward's journey to rebuild his fractured relationships became a delicate balancing act. On one side, there was Emily, his daughter from his marriage to Margaret, and on the other, the Quadruplets, who were just beginning to understand what it meant to have him in their lives. Each relationship required its own approach, its own patience, and its own measure of vulnerability. It wasn't easy, but Edward threw himself into it with a determination he hadn't felt in years. With Emily, progress came slowly. At first, their meetings were stiff and formal, held in public places where neither of them could fully relax. But as weeks turned into months, they found common ground through shared interests. Emily loved photography, and Edward discovered that taking an interest in her work helped bridge the gap between them. He asked thoughtful questions about her projects, complimented her creativity, and even surprised her by gifting her a professional camera lens she'd been eyeing for months. One day, during a walk through a park, Emily finally opened up about how his absence had affected her. "I used to think you didn't care," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "That I wasn't enough to make you stay." Edward's heart clenched at her words. "Emily, I was wrong. So wrong. Leaving your mom was the biggest mistake of my life. And walking away from you, I'll regret that forever. You are more than enough. Always have been." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, but she nodded, accepting his apology without saying another word. From that moment on, their bond began to heal. They started spending more time together, cooking meals, watching movies, or simply sitting in comfortable silence. Though forgiveness didn't come overnight, Edward could see glimpses of the connection they once shared slowly returning. Meanwhile, his relationship with the Quadruplets blossomed in unexpected ways. Noah, Ava, Liam, and Sophie each had unique personalities, and getting to know them individually brought Edward immense joy. Noah loved sports, so Edward took him to basketball games and coached him during weekend practices. Ava had a passion for art, and Edward encouraged her by enrolling her in painting classes and framing her best pieces for display at home. Liam enjoyed science experiments, while Sophie adored music. Edward supported their hobbies wholeheartedly, attending recitals and science fairs whenever possible. Claire watched all of this unfold with cautious optimism. She appreciated Edward's efforts, though she remained protective of the children. They'd gone most of their lives without a father. She reminded him gently during one of their conversations. "Don't rush them, or yourself. Building trust takes time." Edward listened to her advice, knowing she was right. He didn't try to force himself into the role of a perfect dad overnight. Instead, he focused on being present, listening when they needed to talk, cheering them on during milestones, and simply showing up when it mattered. Over time, the Quadruplets began calling him Dad naturally, without prompting. Hearing that word from them filled Edward with a mix of pride and humility. He knew he still had much to prove, but every small victory felt like a step in the right direction. As Edward worked to mend these relationships, he also reconnected with Claire in a new way. Their interactions remained platonic, but there was mutual respect now, a quiet understanding that they were both doing their best for the sake of their children. Claire confided in him about the challenges she faced raising the Quadruplets alone, and Edward listened attentively, offering help wherever he could. Together, they created a co-parenting dynamic that prioritized the kids' well-being above everything else. Through it all, Edward learned valuable lessons about love, responsibility, and sacrifice. He realized that being a parent wasn't just about providing financially. It was about showing up emotionally, being patient, and putting others' needs before his own. The guilt of his past choices never fully disappeared, but it no longer consumed him. Instead, it fueled his desire to be better, for Emily, for the quadruplets, and for himself. By the end of the year, Edward's life looked vastly different from what it had been before. His days were busier, filled with school events, family dinners, and heartfelt conversations. Yet, despite the chaos, he felt a sense of fulfillment he'd never experienced before. For the first time in years, Edward understood that true wealth wasn't measured in money or possessions. It was found in the connections we nurture and the legacy we leave behind. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly have its challenges, he was ready to face them head-on, one step at a time. Edward's transformation didn't happen overnight, but over time, the man who once chased wealth and fleeting pleasures became someone entirely different. He learned that success wasn't about how much money you made or how many accolades you collected. It was about the lives you touched and the love you gave. Each day brought new challenges, but also new opportunities to grow, to heal, and to make amends. With Emily, their bond deepened as they continued to spend time together. She began inviting him to important events in her life: a college graduation ceremony, a photography exhibition where her work was showcased, even casual coffee dates when she needed advice. Edward cherished these moments, realizing that being present mattered more than anything else. One evening, after a long talk about her dreams of becoming a professional photographer, Emily turned to him and said, "I'm glad we're doing this, Dad. I missed having you around." Those words meant the world to Edward. They weren't just an acknowledgement of his efforts. They were proof that healing was possible, even after years of hurt. Though scars from the past remained, both father and daughter worked to move forward, building something stronger than before. As for the quadruplets, Edward embraced his role as their dad with a fervor that surprised even himself. He attended every school play, cheered loudly at soccer matches, and helped them navigate the ups and downs of growing up. The children, in turn, taught him lessons he never expected. Through their laughter, curiosity, and resilience, they reminded him what it meant to live fully and authentically. On weekends, the house buzzed with activity as Noah practiced dribbling in the backyard. Ava painted vibrant landscapes at the dining table. Liam conducted science experiments in the kitchen, and Sophie played melodies on the piano. For Edward, these chaotic yet beautiful moments became the highlight of his life. Claire noticed the change in him too. While she remained cautious, she couldn't deny that Edward had stepped up in ways she hadn't anticipated. "You've come a long way," she told him one evening after a family dinner. "The kids adore you, and honestly, so do I." Not in a romantic way, she added quickly, smiling, "but as someone who genuinely cares about them, and us." Edward smiled back, grateful for her honesty. Their partnership, though unconventional, worked because it was built on trust and shared goals. Together, they created a stable environment for the quadruplets, proving that families didn't have to fit a traditional mold to thrive. Even Isabella faded into the background of Edward's life. Their marriage ended quietly, without drama or bitterness. Isabella moved on, finding happiness elsewhere, while Edward focused on rebuilding what truly mattered. Looking back, he realized that leaving her hadn't been a loss. It had been a liberation. It allowed him to rediscover who he was and what he valued most. Years later, as Edward sat surrounded by his children during a holiday gathering, he reflected on how far he'd come. Margaret was there too, sitting beside Emily with a warm smile. Though their relationship would never return to what it once was, they had found a new kind of peace, a mutual understanding that prioritized Emily's happiness above all else. Edward knew he wasn't perfect. He still carried regrets, mistakes he wished he could undo. But he also knew that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it and using those lessons to build a better future. As he looked around the room, at Emily laughing with her siblings, at the quadruplets playing games, at Margaret sharing stories with Claire, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. For the first time in his life, Edward understood that true fulfillment came not from chasing perfection, but from embracing imperfection. It came from showing up, staying committed, and loving deeply, even when it was hard. And as he raised his glass in a toast to family, he silently vowed to keep doing just that, for as long as he lived.